Hello and welcome to the lecture for Module 5. In Module 5, we're going to be discussing how culture and religion impact and affect domestic violence or intimate partner violence. We're also going to discuss the impact on domestic violence on some special victims. It's kind of an odd term to use, but it describes very specific populations of people and how those folks suffer the same types of abuse as other victims in the general public. But there's also some special considerations about how they are impacted. In the lecture, we're going to cover culture, religion, honor killings, male victims of DV, and the LBGT community. In this week's textbook assignment, you're going to read about disabled victims of DV, special circumstances that occur when the abusive partner is a police officer, rural victims. You're going to have an article on religion and domestic violence, and you have two videos this week, one on a specific honor killing and one on domestic violence from a male victim's perspective. So as we think of the United States as a very diverse country, especially in New York State, where we have New York City being what's always been referred to as the melting pot of the United States, where people from all of the world come to live and work and raise their children. We know that in the years 2018 to 2020, that the most common origins of immigrants to the U.S. are from the countries listed here, and they're just listed in alphabetical order. If we just look at that list on the left side of the page, you see that people from these countries represent a very wide range of cultures, language, and traditions. And these are just the most common origins of immigrants to the U.S. in the last 2 years. Of course, we know that people immigrate to the United States from all over the world. And in every culture and country, there are their own traditions, their own social norms, languages, customs, and religions. Some countries have numerous languages spoken in just one country. Some countries, like the United States, have people who practice hundreds of different religions. So when you're working with victims of domestic violence who are from outside of the United States, you have to have knowledge that not only are these people experiencing all of the impacts of domestic violence and intimate partner violence that we've discussed in previous modules, these people also face numerous additional issues, such as many of these people have a vulnerable immigration status. So an abusive partner can threaten to turn them into an immigration authority, which can cause them to be incarcerated and ultimately deported. That's a very vulnerable position to have an ambiguous legal status in a country. Obviously, there's language issues. So someone who's a victim of domestic violence who does not speak English as a first language or has very limited proficiency in English is going to find it especially difficult to find help or assistance. People who come from other countries to the U.S. often lack knowledge about how the U.S. legal system and other service agencies work. They don't know if they can even seek assistance from law enforcement, and if they do, what happens after they seek that assistance. And the same goes for service agencies. They don't know maybe what agencies exist, what help is offered, whether or not it costs money, whether or not you need insurance, or even how to locate or contact those agencies. And many people who immigrate to the United States come alone. They don't come to the United States with a lot of friends or family members. So many of these people have an especial vulnerability because they have no support in their community. Those are just a few of the issues that immigrants in the United States face, in addition to all the other impacts and effects of domestic violence. They have all these additional problems and barriers to getting help. There are 44.8 million people in the United States who were born in other countries. That is a tremendous population. That is a larger population of people than most countries. So you know that if you work in any area of the criminal justice system, whether it be in law enforcement, probation, or parole, especially if you're working in any type of social service agencies or you're working with victims of domestic violence, it's likely you're going to encounter clients who weren't born in the United States. So it's just really important to remember that we need to open ourselves to other viewpoints, other cultures, other identities outside of our own if you happen to have been born in this country. Or if you were an immigrant yourself, that we still have to be open to the fact that people come from other countries, speak other languages, have other cultures and traditions that we may not be familiar with. And all of that is going to impact that person's particular story. It's going to have a huge impact on their identification of a victim, how domestic violence is viewed in their own community or within their own religious practice. So it's just really important for those of us who work in this field to constantly become more knowledgeable about the cultures and traditions of other countries. So when we're trying to serve those people, we can serve them more effectively. Now, it's really difficult to talk about how culture and thousands of cultures can impact victims of domestic violence in a couple of PowerPoint slides. That's kind of silly to even suggest I could do that. But as an introductory class, the purpose of this is to just bring forth the issues of how culture impacts domestic violence. We could spend an entire semester on just this topic, but we're just going to cover it briefly here. So the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and other international groups have studied domestic violence, intimate partner violence, in that's committed against women all across the world. And these are the countries that those organizations has identified as having the highest rates of domestic violence against women. And if you look at this list, which is presented in alphabetical order, it's pretty easy to identify that oftentimes the countries with the highest rates of domestic violence against women are also those countries with cultures that are strongly, fiercely patriarchal and or that practice adherence to strict religious rules that subjugate or oppress women. The countries with an asterisk next to them, Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, actually have the highest rates of domestic violence against women, even amongst all these other countries that have high rates. So the rates are extraordinarily high in Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. And the case we're going to learn more about this week on honor killings is actually from Pakistan. And the World Health Organization and United Nations have actually estimated that the incident or rate of domestic violence in Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan is upwards of 60% of all women in these countries experience some form of domestic violence during their lifetimes. Extraordinarily high rates. And one of the ways we hear about this domestic violence demonstrated is in what is referred to as honor killings. And an honor killing is a murder of a family member due to the perpetrator's belief the victim has brought shame or dishonor upon their family, or that the victim has violated a rule of that family's religion. And the underlying belief here is that women's bodies are the repository of a family's honor. And they mean that almost in a literal sense, that the entire family's honor, which could include 30, 40, or 50 more people, is actually held within a woman's body. So therefore, what a woman does with her body, in public or in private, actually impacts how shame can be brought upon the entire family. In this week's videos, you're going to have a video about the Kohistan case. Kohistan is a community in rural Pakistan where in 2011, several young women were at a wedding dressed very conservatively in compliance with the customs of their religion, and they were watching a couple of their brothers and friends of their family dance. So the boys are dancing to music, and the girls are huddled together and they're smiling and clapping. And unfortunately, someone videotaped that on a cell phone. And that video was released among these people's community. And upon seeing that video, and remember, all the girls did was smile and clap their hands to the music, an extreme fundamentalist Muslim cleric in their community decreed the boys who were dancing in the video had to be murdered, the families of the boys dancing in the video had to be murdered, and the 5 girls who did nothing but smile and clap to the music also has to be murdered. Now, honor killings are about shame brought against a family. So the perpetrators of the murders are always family members. And in this particular case, 2 fathers to the girls, one of the girls' brothers, and several other family members agreed to murder all of the young people seen in this video. Afzal Kohestani's sister, and Afzal is pictured here, was one of the 5 women captured, tortured, and murdered for smiling and clapping at the wedding. His brothers who were dancing in the video were also murdered. And Afzal spent years, almost a decade, fighting in his community to bring justice for these victims, to have the perpetrators of this violence punished. And of course, what he's advocating for is the punishment of his own family members who committed these crimes. So his family is both the victim and the perpetrator. And he fought bravely to bring public attention to this specific honor killing and to this practice that's committed worldwide. His own life was threatened, the life of his child, his spouse was threatened, and ultimately Afzal was murdered in March of 2019 for trying to bring justice to these victims. And you're going to learn a lot more about this case in this week's video. So how many honor killings occur worldwide? Well, of course, it's impossible to have an exact figure, right? We talked about the statistical analysis and collection of crime victim data and the problems that are related to that. But just like those international groups study incidents of domestic violence across the world against all different groups of people, they also collect data and research the incidents of honor killings. And the United Nations reports that there's approximately 5,000 honor killings around the world every single year. There's approximately 1,000 in Pakistan, and there's approximately 1,000 in India. The remaining 3,000 are spread amongst different countries. And of course, 93% of honor killing victims are women. And remember, that goes to the underlying premise of an honor killing, is that the pride of a family, the honor of a family, is contained within a woman's body. So therefore, women are much more likely to be victims of honor killings because anything they do with their body can bring shame upon their family. And the United States Department of Justice estimates that there's 30 honor killings in the United States every single year. So this isn't something we can disregard as only occurring far away in foreign countries we'll never visit or really need to know anything about. It also happens right here in the United States. There's several common justifications, and I probably should have put justifications in quotes here because obviously there's no real justification for an honor killing. But the family members of these victims who justify their actions use these reasons. That the woman who was murdered was the victim of a rape or a sexual assault. And notice I underlined victim. If a woman in these communities is raped or sexually assaulted, she's the victim of a sexual crime, because that happened to her body, she, the victim, has now brought shame upon that family and must be severely punished or murdered, even though she was the victim. Just wearing inappropriate clothing or clothing that does not comply with a particular religious practice, wearing jewelry, wearing makeup, wearing a skirt, showing too much skin in public, can result in actually being murdered. Laughing or flirting in public, being in public without a chaperone, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes, refusing a marriage proposal, certainly even attempting to get divorced or separated from one's spouse is often cited as the reason for an honor killing, and any type of premarital sex. So again, this is often related not only to culture, but very strict adherence to archaic religious tenets, the foundation of which is the oppression of women. These are often communities and cultures in which women are not allowed to be in public by themselves. They are often not allowed to go to school or only allowed to go to school for a couple of years. Oftentimes, these women are prohibited from driving. Okay, so these are very, very conservative communities where women are oppressed to the point where them even appearing in public or having a sip of beer could result in them being murdered. We're now going to change topics completely. When we looked through domestic violence in modules 1, 2, and 3, we talked about domestic abuse that's inflicted on both men and women, but because women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence, the focus was primarily on women. And it's very important in this course that we discuss and learn more about the fact that men are victims of domestic violence. That is absolutely a proven fact. And you might remember the graphic on the right side of the slide where we learned that 1 in 3 women is a domestic violence victim during her lifetime in this country. And that also goes for 1 in 4 men. So although we talked about that briefly, now we're going to focus in on this 1 in 4 men. Now 1 in 4 would mean 25%, but it's actually a little higher than that. There's a very reliable statistics that research supports that it's more like 28.5% of men in the US who are victims of domestic violence during their lifetime. And it's critically important to remember that the same types of abuse that men inflict upon women, women also inflict upon men. It's the same types of abuse we've talked about: physical abuse, sexual assault, isolation, verbal abuse, financial constraints. All of those things we talked about in relation to men committing acts of domestic violence against women also apply in the reverse when a woman is the abusive partner in the relationship. But male victims also face a few unique problems as victims of domestic violence. One of them is that female abusers have the ability to manipulate police in these situations where acts of domestic violence occur. For example, oftentimes, if there's an act of physical violence within the home and one or both of the partners call 911 and the police show up, police are much more likely to believe that only the woman was a victim and that the man was solely the perpetrator and was not in any way, shape, or form a victim. And women are more likely to be viewed as the victim in family court. So even though you may have the man is solely the victim, oftentimes they're not perceived that way in court. Male victims also have to contend with several additional issues to obtain help. Now, it's very difficult for female victims to obtain help, and men actually have a few more complications. For example, many DV service agencies offer no help to male victims, or they have significantly less services and support for men. One example of this is there's many domestic violence shelters, places where people can actually go and live and spend the night to get out of the abuse in their homes, many of those shelters do not serve men at all. So a male victim who needs housing, especially in an emergency, maybe has to leave a home at 3 o'clock in the morning, there are no shelters that offer services for men. Men also face our social stigmas, our cultural stigmas about being perceived as weak or not in control in a relationship. So, culturally in the United States, generally speaking, we don't expect women to be dominant and controlling in a relationship. But in some communities, there's a very strong preference for that for men. So a male victim may be even more reluctant to face criticism from people in the community about how could you possibly let this happen to you? You're the man, sort of thing. And traditional gender roles complicate a man seeing himself as a victim. And that's going to make it even harder to disclose to family members or friends. One of the other groups of people that we want to talk about who face specific challenges as victims of domestic violence is the LGBT community. Of course, that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And folks in this community are frequently victims of domestic violence. But there's a slightly different twist here because people in the LGBT community can be victims of domestic violence in two different ways. One is that, of course, they can be partnered with an abusive person, a spouse or a significant other who's abusive. But members of the LGBT community often frequently are abused by their own parents and siblings. So it's domestic violence in the old-fashioned view of the term, meaning who's within your residence. And it's also about intimate partner violence for people in this community. Again, just like male victims, victims in the LGBT community experience the same types of abuse as their heterosexual peers, and they also are victimized by the same manipulative tactics as their heterosexual peers. But they also face additional issues. Somebody in this community is also going to be very vulnerable to a threat of outing, meaning that maybe people in their community, their friends or family members, don't know that they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Maybe they've kept that hidden from those people. So, in addition to all the verbal abuse an abusive partner hurls at their victim, they're also going to make threats of outing them. If you don't do what I want, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to tell your father you're gay. I'm going to tell your mother you're a lesbian. I'm going to tell everybody you work with that you're transgender. So that's an additional type of intimidation and coercion that abusers can use against someone in the LGBT community. A lot of people in this community also lack family support before they even become a victim. Due to different cultural, religious, traditional practices, many people will reject a family member who discloses that they're LGBT. So all victims of domestic violence usually have a severe lack of family support and support from friends due to what? What do abusers use? What tactic do they use to make it so it's really difficult to have support from friends and family? Isolation, right? So people in the LGBT community are already more isolated before they even become victims of domestic violence. So they're doubly isolated. Again, verbal abuse can be very specific to people in the LGBT community, mocking, using very derogatory terms about their gender identity. And people in the LGBT community have a justified lack of faith in the police and in the legal system. There are still, many areas where gay marriage is, strongly discouraged, whether legally or socially. Even our own textbook talks about LGBT relationships, like marriage, is not a legal thing, but just a conceptual thing. That's how new the legality of gay marriage is. So, why would you seek help from a legal system that doesn't even recognize you and your partner as having a legitimate relationship? So, that's just one other factor that people in this community are going to have to face in trying to get help. And the other part of it, of course, outside is the intimate partner violence, is people in the LGBT community often experience violence within their own family unit. Especially male members of this community are frequently subjected to severe and even lethal forms of physical violence from parents and siblings, especially from fathers and from their brothers. Young LGBT men and women are often thrown out of their family homes with no resources or support. And we know that because 40% of homeless young people identify as LGBT. So they have an incredibly high incidence of homelessness due to rejection from primary family members. And we also know that the rates of drug addiction and suicidality are much higher for LGBT youth than other populations. So when we're talking about LGBT domestic violence victims, there's two important things to remember. They may be facing violence from two different sides, one from their own intimate partner and also from their own family members. So that's the end of your lecture for Module 5, but of course, as always, you have a lot of other work to do. There's 3 different sections in your textbook to read. It looks like a lot, but it's really only 9 pages total. You're going to read short sections on family violence committed by police officers, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, presents some special problems. Domestic violence victims who have disabilities, and rural victims, those domestic violence victims who are living far from large cities or any source of social service or law enforcement support. You're going to read an article about religion and domestic violence, and you have 2 videos this week. The first video is on that case we just discussed of the honor killing that occurred in Pakistan due to the video taken at the wedding. That one's 21 minutes long, and then you have a very short video, just 9 minutes, it was actually created. It was a film created by a British college student who wanted to illustrate and demonstrate what domestic violence looks like when the man is the victim. And that video is just 9 minutes long. You also have a quiz this week. The quiz is on everything covered in Module 5. Like always, it'll open Friday, October 2nd at 8 a.m. and will close. You must complete it by Monday, October 5th at just before midnight. There is no project this week and there is no discussion board this week. As always, if you have any questions, if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know.